The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chayaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Welcome one and all to another edition of Things Are About to Get Weird. I'm recording this on the 24th of May and I have some very exciting news to share. At lunchtime today, I found out that this show has hit number 1 on the Spotify UK True Crime chart. Ooh, my voice wobbled there for a second. It has made me really emotional. I've done a few social media posts about this already, so I won't go on too much right now, but I just wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of you for being so supportive of the show. You are all incredible. I am so grateful for every single one of you. You have helped Things Are About to Get Weird to become a chart-topping podcast. I can't believe it. It's truly amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But before I get too carried away, which I definitely could, I'm going to focus back onto why we're here today. Over the past year or so, I've had numerous requests to cover the mysterious story of the Isdal Woman. I believe that one of our listeners, Joanne, was the first person to ask for this one, and there have been many more since. This tale is known as one of Norway's most captivating unsolved incidents, and features bizarre detail after bizarre detail. It really is incredibly strange. Now, if you're a regular listener, you'll know that I've never done this before, but I am actually going to be splitting this story into 2 parts. Once I got deep into my research, I realised that because there is so much to cover here, I'm going to have to break this tale up in order to cover it properly and do the story justice. I mentioned this over on our social media pages, but there will be some slight changes to our schedule over the next few weeks, so here's how this will play out. We have part 1 today, then there'll be a new weird fix on the 19th of June, then part 2 of this case will be with you on the 26th of June. I hope that's all okay. It's a busy old time at the moment, but as always, my priority is bringing you the best content possible, and I think and hope it will all be worth the wait. I'm pulling a Bridgerton, if you will, with this kind of gap between the 2 parts, but out of necessity in my case rather than to create unnecessary suspense. There is a lot to cover today, so I'm going to get right into it after I give you a couple of content warnings. There will be numerous references to someone taking their own life in this story, and wider discussions around that topic too, as well as some gruesome details from the outset that I'll try to get past as quickly as possible. But again, they are important in the overall context of this tale. With those warnings given, let's get into the story. On the 29th of November 1970, in a rural region of Norway called Isdalen, often referred to as the Ice Valley, 3 hikers had set out on an early morning walk through the scenic landscape. The trio consisted of 2 sisters and their father, who were making their way through the area which is also sometimes known as Death Valley, when they came across a sight so horrifying it would remain with them for life. It appeared to be the badly burned body of a woman lying on her back across a cluster of rocks. Her arms were extended in a position normally associated with boxers, with her arms and hands out in front of her as though she was preparing for a fight, which is sadly consistent with the pose a body can take on if it has been burned alive. This next detail is also horrible, but because the front of the woman's body had been so badly damaged, it was impossible to tell what she had originally looked like. Her face was entirely unrecognizable. Most of her clothing had also been destroyed. The man and his daughters quickly returned to the nearby city of Bergen, which is just a few miles away from the remote hiking spot, and reported what they had discovered to the local police. Officers were naturally alarmed to hear the family's account of what they had discovered, and after arriving at the scene and uncovering further details about the state of the woman's remains, they only grew more confused. One such officer, a police lawyer named Carl Halvor As, was among the first to respond, and he later told the BBC that, quote, "It was out of the way, it was an unusual place to walk." He added that there was a strong smell of burning flesh lingering lingering in the air, but officers soon realized that although burns were present all over the front of the woman's body, there were none on the back half of her, the side that had been lying against the rocks. Carl remarked that it appeared as though she had thrown herself back from a fire, but as far as I can find, no mention of a nearby campfire was noted as being present at the spot near to where she lay. However, that's not to say that the area around her was devoid of clues. As soon as officers started to look around the vicinity for any answers as to who the woman was or what had happened to her, they found several items which presented nothing but further questions. Belongings that the police determined were connected with the unidentified woman were discovered near to her body. These items included a watch, a broken umbrella, a few pieces of jewelry, and a number of different bottles, one of them being a liqueur bottle. But what the officers found odd is that it appeared as though these objects had been placed around her in what some have described as a ritualistic fashion. From photos of the items, you can see that many of them are clearly charred. For example, the watch face is partially obscured by a sooty black mark, and the bottles look to have been slightly melted. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that these items, along with the remnants of clothing that they'd been able to analyze, all had something rather bizarre in common. Any and all labels, tags, and other identifying features had been entirely removed from the woman's belongings. There was nothing on any of the items that gave any indication as to the brands of the pieces or where they'd been manufactured. These seem to have been manually removed from the objects placed around the woman's remains. For example, the labels on her clothing had been cut out rather than burned off when she'd been set alight. Another curious detail, according to some sources, was that a plastic cover for a passport was also uncovered, but no trace of the document itself was found. Despite being unable to garner any information as to the woman's identity from the scene itself, the investigators had a little more luck when they were able to track down eyewitnesses, who they believed may have seen their Jane Doe before her untimely death. Though none of them could tell police her name or where she had come from, they were helpful in providing physical descriptions of her. Through their inquiries, the authorities determined that the woman had been just over 5 feet 4 inches tall and aged between 25 and 40 years old. Her face was described as small and round. Her ears were noted as being small as well, with her eyes a shade of brown. Witnesses said that her hair was brownish black and long, tied up in a ponytail which was secured with a blue and white print ribbon. One eyewitness, who believes he saw the Isdal woman shortly before she passed away, made some interesting remarks when speaking with the BBC decades later. He noted that she was dressed in clothing far more suited to visiting a town than hiking in the outdoors, especially during November in Norway. I'll be referring back to this eyewitness again in part 2, as he remembered several other fascinating details about his sighting of the mysterious visitor. But in terms of identifying characteristics from witnesses close to the scene, that was about it. Unsurprisingly, the news of what had taken place in the so-called Death Valley was shocking to locals, despite the history of the area. The spot had received its rather ominous nickname due to being renowned as a place where people would go to take their own lives during the Middle Ages, and it was terrible to now realize that the name would now be linked to a new tragedy. In the obvious absence of any clues as to who the lady in the valley was, she was given the temporary moniker of the Isdal Woman, or at least it was meant to be temporary. As we'll see, this tale was destined to remain far more of a mystery than anyone involved anticipated. But I'm getting ahead of myself, let's focus on the events of 1970. Whilst news of the Isdal woman's awful fate spread rapidly around Bergen, to the horror and bemusement of local residents, investigators continued to work in the background to try and crack the case. And just a few days later, a promising lead was reported to them, originating at the Bergen railway station. police discovered that 2 suitcases had been located at the station's left luggage facility, and it was suspected that they could have belonged to the poor soul found in Ice Valley. Officers decided to open up the suitcases, both of which looked to be made of leather, though one was darker in shade than the other, and their contents were both intriguing and, as it turns out, frustrating. In one suitcase, police found a pair of prescription-free glasses, and although the eyewear was unremarkable at first glance, that all changed when the glasses were dusted for fingerprints. It was found that the prints on one of the lenses were a match for the Isdal Woman, giving investigators confirmation that the suitcases likely had belonged to her. But their excitement about this development was short-lived. It's not that there weren't other items to analyse within the luggage. The list of belongings was extensive and included clothing, a hairbrush, a comb, a tube of eczema cream, several wigs, and currency from not only Norway, but England, Germany, Sweden, and Belgium too. But the problem was that, like the items that had been found with the Isdal woman's body, any identifying information had once again been scrubbed from the contents of the suitcases. Like the clothing she had been wearing when she died, the garments in the woman's luggage had had the labels cut out. There were also some cosmetics in one of the bags, and investigators even attempted to contact various department stores across Europe to try and identify the packaging, but they were unsuccessful. Even the label on the eczema cream, which would have offered up details of the woman's name or possibly her doctor's information, had been scratched off and anonymized. Although the police's initial enthusiasm after finding the luggage had waned, it wasn't completely dampened. Among the items in the suitcases were 2 finds that piqued the interest of the authorities. The first was a plastic bag from a shoe shop in the Norwegian city of Stavanger, and the second was a handwritten note that looked to have been some kind of code. More on the note later. It does become significant in relation to one of the key theories in this case. But for now, back to the plastic bag. This was arguably the most tangible clue that had been found in the case so far, in that investigators had somewhere to visit to make further inquiries, which is exactly what they did. They travelled to the shoe shop and were able to speak with the owner's son, a man named Rolf Rødtvet, who, upon hearing the description of the Isdal woman, appeared to remember selling her a pair of rubber boots. He told police that the woman had been, quote, well-dressed and nice-looking, and he remembered her specifically because she took a considerable amount of time to choose the pair of boots she eventually purchased. Rolf showed the officers which style of boots he had sold to the dark-haired lady, and it soon became clear that they were a match to the shoes the Isdal woman had been wearing before her death. Furthermore, he was able to provide a few more distinguishing details about her. He said that she spoke in English but with an accent, and that she had a calm and quiet expression. Although it wasn't a huge amount to go on, it helped to build more of a picture of who the woman may have been, and this picture was enough for police to be able to trace her movements back to a hotel, located just a few miles away from the shoe shop. Now, as we move into this next phase of the investigation, the mystery only deepens. But I wanted to take a step back for a moment because it's important to note that whilst all of this had been going on, an autopsy had been performed on the Isdal woman's body, and what it revealed was baffling. Prepare yourselves. It found that there were no signs that the woman had been unwell before she died, but that she had consumed a high quantity of sleeping pills, between 50 and 70. However, and this is really hideous, the examination showed that they had not been fully absorbed into her bloodstream before she passed away. This, combined with the fact that there were smoke particles found in her lungs, confirmed that she was more than likely alive as she burnt. There was also a high concentration of carbon monoxide in her blood, and as traces of petrol were found on the ground under her body, it was determined that this had been used during the process of her being set alight. But here's the thing that I just found extraordinary. At the end of the autopsy, it was ruled that the Isdal woman had probably died by suicide. You can probably tell in my voice that I sound unsure, and although the chief of police in Bergen was in favour of this ruling, many others in law enforcement shared my scepticism. Carl Halvor As, the officer I mentioned earlier, was one of those who didn't fully understand the findings and told the BBC, quote, "We talked about it in the police, but as far as I remember, very few thought it was suicide. Officially, it was recorded that the cause of death was a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and an overdose of the sleeping tablets, but many questioned why someone who had already ingested so many pills would then additionally decide to do something as unimaginably excruciating as setting themselves on fire." Oh gosh, it's so awful to think about. I really do find this case so sad. We're going to move back to the wider investigation, but we'll refer to the autopsy results again later in the story. So, we're back at the hotel in Stavanger where the Isdal woman was thought to have previously stayed. Staff there told investigators that a lady matching the description of the Jane Doe checked in under the name Fenella Lorch. However, this was soon confirmed to have been a false name, but that wasn't the half of it. Police were able to follow the trail of the woman back even further to a number of different hotels all over Norway. I counted 9 from the evidence that I've seen, and during many of the check-ins she used a different alias. This is odd, but it begins to switch over from being strange to suspicious when you consider that for every fake name the woman had, she would have had to show a corresponding passport. From looking at the records, we can assume that at least 5 or 6 of these documents would have had to have been fake. The first known hotel stay the Isdal woman had in Norway during this period was in March of 1970, when she stayed at the Viking Hotel in Oslo, calling herself Genevieve Lancia. There are lots of time gaps in the list, particularly between April and October of 1970, but we can see numerous stays at different establishments leading up to her arrival as Fenella Lorch in Stavanger. That was on the 9th of November. From there, she travelled to Bergen and stayed at 2 final hotels that we know of. The last one she was seen in was Hotel Hordehimen in the city on the 23rd of November. If at this point you're thinking, well, how did the authorities know for sure that this was the same person checking in at all these different hotels? Fascinatingly, there were patterns of behaviour and other distinctive characteristics about her that were reported across the board, no matter where she stayed. For example, and probably most significantly, the handwriting she used to fill in the paperwork at each hotel matched up perfectly. When you look at the side-by-side photos, it's undoubtedly a match. But there was more. Many of those who encountered her said that it was clear she was wearing a wig, and as several were discovered in the suitcases, this definitely tracks. It was also said that at least one time per stay, she would usually request to change her room, with one hotel saying she asked to move 3 separate times. Many staff members said that she spoke English, though she'd sometimes throw in a few German phrases during conversations. And when it comes to her personality, I found it quite fascinating to learn that she was, by all accounts, quite charismatic, or at least that she carried herself with an air of confidence. A woman who was a 21-year-old waitress at the time she encountered the Isdal woman at Hotel Neptune in Bergen remembered that, quote, "My first impression of her was one of elegance and self-assuredness. She looked so fashionable, I wished to be able to mimic her style. In fact, I remember her winking at me. From my perspective, it felt as though she thought I had been staring at her a bit too much. On one occasion, while I was serving her, she was in the dining hall sitting right next to, but not interacting with, 2 German Navy personnel, one of which was an officer." Further consistently noted features about the woman were the gap in her front teeth, her fondness for wearing a fur hat, a preference for porridge at breakfast time, and the fact that she often smelled quite strongly of garlic. This one crops up a lot. I guess it's the kind of thing you'd remember about someone if it was that noticeable, but it ended up being a helpful puzzle piece when forming a picture of her movements. Yet, despite all of this information about her travels being uncovered, it simply didn't help in the overall effort to discover the woman's true identity. Don't forget that during this time, the widespread use of things like CCTV was still massively in its infancy, and techniques that police might use today to try and track someone and figure out who they were just didn't exist in the same way then. With no answers and unsure of what more they could do, the authorities decided that the Isdal woman's remains should be buried, and on the 5th of February 1971, that's exactly what happened. She was laid to rest in a Catholic cemetery in Bergen, as police believed that this was likely in line with her faith, and the case was ultimately closed. However, it was clear that not all hope was lost, as she was actually buried in a zinc coffin which would not decompose. This was so that, should her family ever be found and wish to take her coffin back to her home country, it would be easier for them to do so. Photos from the funeral were also captured and stored by investigators, so that they could eventually share them with the Isdal woman's family should she ever be identified. I found that detail to be so touching. It's a really considerate and human moment within this case. So from here, we move into the initial theory section of this story. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about the coded note. That actually forms part of one of the first and most prominent potential explanations that the public seemed to latch onto quite early on in the case. A huge piece of context within this story is that it took place during the Cold War period, and even though this era spanned for decades from 1947 to 1991, it's the secretive behaviour and movements of the Isdal woman prior to her death, combined with the time period, that caused so many to believe that she could have been a spy. And here we get to the note. So, as I mentioned, there was a piece of paper found in one of the suitcases that had some strange letter and number combinations written largely in lists in blue ink. Before the code was cracked, police were heavily suspicious that it could be linked to certain reports suggesting the woman had observed some military tests in the west of Norway that were all to do with Norwegian Penguin missiles. It appeared that some of her travels lined up with several tests that had been carried out in recent years, and it was thought that if they could decipher the note, her writings could provide them with confirmation that she was involved in some kind of espionage. This theory was bolstered by the fact that she did stand out. Many of the places she visited in Norway weren't necessarily known as tourist hotspots, and her wealthy world traveller persona felt somewhat out of place. By all accounts, the idea that there were spies in Norway during this time period is not at all far-fetched. In fact, many are sure that undercover agents from Russia and Israel at least were certainly present in the country at this time. But once again, investigators pursuing this theory were met with disappointment when it came to the handwritten note. When it was finally decoded, it appeared to be nothing more than a log of the different cities and locations she had visited, information that was largely already known to police. Still weird, of course, but not hugely helpful in furthering the investigation. Many questions still remained. Had she been a spy? If so, had she been murdered? If so again, who had done it and why? And if this angle was a total red herring and she really had taken her own life, what was the reason for everything she had done in the build-up, for making herself so anonymous and for ending things in such a horrific manner? In addition to the spy theory, other ideas were floated, suggesting that perhaps she was a criminal on the run from authorities in whichever country she had originated from, or been staying in prior, or that she was running away from some other kind of trouble. But again, there was simply no evidence to confirm or support these ideas at the time. As much as this case had gripped Norway and the rest of the world in time, not a single solid answer emerged in the years immediately following her death. After all, the case was officially closed, and so many lines of inquiry had gone cold that it seemed that there was nothing more to be done. But much of this would eventually change, and here we arrive at why I wanted to split this episode into 2 parts. There have been numerous updates over the past few years, which I thought I could fit neatly into one episode, but it would be a real shame to rush things as there is so much to tell you. There have been real efforts made over the past 8 years or so to try and help change the status of this story from notorious unsolved mystery to a fully explained and concluded case, and the twists and turns of what this has entailed so far are really compelling. At the end of the day, the Isdal Woman had a name. She wasn't a faceless folklore-style figure. She was a human being, and she deserves to be remembered by name. No one should remain a Jane Doe forever. So I'm going to leave this tale here for today. I know it's a bit of a cliffhanger, but it's the most logical place to pause until I can bring you part 2. This isn't necessarily going to be a common occurrence, by the way. I didn't initially intend to do my very first 2-parter today, but I hope the second half will be well worth the wait. So, although this episode is a little different in structure, I am still going to bring you our usual outro feature. But just before I do, I think it would be fascinating for you to share your theories with me at this point in the Isdal Woman tale. I've had all sorts of ideas mulling around in my head, but I would love to know what you think too. I will be mentioning all of our social media pages and ways to get in touch very soon, right after a quick trip over to Weird Media. I'm taking another gamble in today's Weird Media. I've done this once before and it paid off, so fingers crossed I'm lucky again today. I'm going to be recommending a series to you that I haven't quite finished yet. I think I'm most of the way through. Sometimes I get scared to check in case I see a spoiler. I think perhaps I still have an episode or 2 to go, but I am absolutely enthralled by it. I can't stop thinking about this program. It's truly fascinating. And the TV show I'm talking about is Three Body Problem. It's on Netflix and it's an adaptation of a series of science fiction novels. When the title's translated from Chinese to English, it's known as Remembrance of Earth's Past. But the show is called Three Body Problem. Now, if you're a big Game of Thrones fan like myself, you'll be familiar with the co-creators of that show, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. They're actually the co-creators of this series too, along with Alexander Wu. And you can definitely tell, in my opinion, there's something about the feel of Three Body Problem that is Game of Thrones-esque at times. And there are some familiar faces in the cast too. Liam Cunningham, who was Sir Davos, plays a character that I predict will become quite key. We'll have to see. And you'll be sure to spot many others along the way too. John Bradley, who played Sam Tarly, is brilliant. And Jonathan Pryce, the High Sparrow, pops up too, so it's a real treat from that perspective. But there are so many other talented performers in the cast too. Benedict Wong is incredible in the show so far. I love him anyway, but he is extra brilliant in this. They really have cast this show so well that acting is amazing. But storyline-wise, it's definitely sci-fi. There are lots of themes around time and space and physics and VR, but there are also some really human moments too, so there's balance there. The reason I'm not telling you too much about the exact storyline is because it kind of reveals itself as we go along. You see lots of strange things happening to the characters, many of whom are scientists, and you follow along as they're trying to work out why, so it's part of the process of watching the show. But also I don't want to over-explain because 1, I'm not sure I can. There is a lot of science going on, and 2, I think it's the kind of show you just have to immerse yourself in. It has just been renewed for a second series, so I have lots of faith that I'll continue to love it, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. If it sounds like your cup of tea, I really hope you enjoy it as much as I am too. Right, some quick source shout-outs for this episode. We have 2 fantastic articles from the BBC, one by Helia Chung from May 2017, and another by Marit Higraff and Neil McCarthy from June 2019. More on those 2 next time, by the way. They actually become key figures within this case themselves, which is quite fascinating. There was a Discovery UK piece that was from May of 2022, and all that's interesting article by Gina DeMuro, edited by John Kurowski. That was last updated in March of 2024. An article from Norwegian site The Local, published in May of 2017. And finally, for now, a piece from The Press and Journal by Chris McLennan from October 2021. To get in touch on social media and share your thoughts and theories, we are at Things Get Weird Podcast over on Instagram and Threads. On Facebook, you can find our main page and private discussion group by searching for Things Are About to Get Weird. As I've mentioned before, the Spotify Q&A function is a brilliant way to interact with the show too. And if you've enjoyed this episode, a quick rating or review wherever you're listening is a fantastic way to show your support. Last but not least, our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for joining me today, and after the short break I mentioned, I'll be back on the 19th of June for our next edition of Weird Fix. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.